Hello, welcome back to ITWeb TV at the Security Summit 2024. I'm joined here by Khumo Mogamisi. I said that right?
Yes, you did.
Good. Who is head of IT risk and compliance at Alexforbes. Another name that I got right. It used to be Alexander Forbes.
And
now Alex.
Alexforbes.
Okay,
great.
Cool. Okay, so I'm doing well on the names so far.
Yes, you are.
Awesome. Okay, cool. So let's start off with just a quick question. Who are you? What do you do? What do you do at Alexforbes?
Okay. So my name is Khumo Mogamisi. I'm the head of IT risk and compliance at Alexforbes. That is my official title, but really I'm responsible for IT governance as well, in addition to IT risk and compliance. I sit within the IT team and I report directly to the CIO.
Okay.
So effectively, I am first line assurance. So I work together with IT management to make sure that everything governance, IT risk and compliance is in check.
Okay. And you sit with the CIO, but where does the CISO fit in that? How does that kind of...
Yes.
Because to me, like it's about the risk, and risk seems to be more of a CISO thing, but that's maybe because I've been preparing questions for CISOs.
Yes, correct. Okay, so what happens is that what the structure looks like is I report to the CIO as the IT risk and compliance head, and my peer is the CISO who also reports to the CIO.
Okay.
So the both of us actually have a dotted line reporting to the head of enterprise risk management. So we are collectively responsible for cybersecurity risk. Our teams work very closely together because we have to, but he is more of an operational person who does the more cybersecurity operational stuff.
Okay.
And then I look at the IT cybersecurity stuff, but we work together.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So then I think one of the kind of easiest questions to hopefully kind of start the conversation going is, what are the biggest kind of IT risks and perhaps cyber risks and the compliance challenges that South African organizations face?
Okay. Without a doubt, cybersecurity is up top.
Sure.
I mean, a lot of organizations have IT cybersecurity as one of their top 10 risks within the organization. So cybersecurity is really up there. But what we're finding lately is that there is an increase in third-party risk. It is somehow related to cybersecurity risk, because if you think about it, if your third parties don't have, the right things in terms of risk mitigation, making sure that they've got a solid internal control environment, you may be impacted indirectly through them, because we share data, at times we share systems. So it's very important for every organization to sort of have a good handle on what their third parties are doing in terms of risk mitigation. So I would say between cybersecurity and third-party security, those are the top two for me.
Okay. And I think that third-party risk is quite an interesting one, because how do you kind of, I don't want to say how do you police that, but do you assess different parties and I guess you've got to look at their kind of cyber hygiene and their cyber maturity, and then does that play any role in whether you do business with them, or do you just have to kind of push down and say you need to tighten up a bit more on this?
Absolutely. I mean, if you haven't entered into a relationship with a third party, it's a good place to start by assessing what they're doing from a risk mitigation perspective before you get into that relationship. Otherwise, if you are already in a relationship, it's always good to touch base, and we do it through what you call due diligence reviews, where you ask them a couple of questions, get evidence to check what they are doing in terms of risk mitigation. And if they don't come up, high up on the scale, or they're not doing the right thing, obviously the intention is to push them to do a little bit more. Obviously, it may have an impact on them because the continuity of the relationship might be hanging on this. So it's obviously important for them to also come to the party.
Okay, sure.
Right.
So we talked about cybersecurity, and you talked about third-party risk kind of being two of those bigger ones. What are perhaps the more unusual things that maybe get overlooked? I mean, Alexforbes is probably quite well-resourced as an organization. We've got someone who, like yourself, who can kind of take the time to look at these different things. But perhaps some of the smaller organizations, where are the kind of the cyber risks that are maybe being overlooked that perhaps people often ignore that they should be actually paying attention to?
Yeah. So, I mean, as risk practitioners and as CISOs, we look at the big things, how do we protect our environment? How do we, detect if we are being hacked, and how do we respond to it? It's all the, big and fancy things. But you forget about really the simple thing, which is the man on the ground.
Yeah.
So social engineering, without a doubt, is a big thing. Sometimes it does get overlooked because I think, number one, we assume that people know the right things to do. How many times have you heard, somebody saying, I got an email with a link saying I've won something and I clicked on the link. Oops.
Yeah.
But, we think, it would make sense. It's common sense, but it's not really common sense. And I do think that it is important to pay a little bit more focus to that in terms of user training, user awareness, but keep, punting the message, because you don't just do it once and then let it go. It's something that you really need to keep reminding your users. So it's definitely social engineering for me.
Okay. And then how do you measure and quantify risks? I mean, we can obviously say cybersecurity is a risk, but to kind of give more metrics to that, how do you kind of relay that to people within the business?
Yeah. I think it's very important that the messages relate to the right people. So, as cybersecurity professionals and as risk practitioners, we know how to do these things. We can identify the potential risk. We can measure it and say this is the likelihood that it may happen. This is the impact that it would have. But it's very important to then close that gap by communicating it to the right people, which is obviously business, your executives, and the board.
Sure.
And the way in which you do it is you simplify it. I mean, cybersecurity can be a very complex and technical thing, but you simplify it in normal language. But what really makes sense for the business is it going to have an impact on my business operations? And if it does have an impact on business operations, does it mean then it will have a financial impact? So looking at things like, from an operational perspective, from a financial impact, should we get hacked? What is this going to mean? Are we going to lose money? How much money are we going to lose? But also from a reputational perspective.
Sure.
People don't want to do business with people who have been hacked or are at risk of being hacked. So it's really breaking it down to a financial, reputational, as well as operational impact. And I think the business, starts to sit up and listen more because it's their language. They talk numbers. And so if you say, if this thing happens, this is what it means for the business at a financial level, operational level, reputational level, then it starts meaning something to them.
Okay. And then are there any tools, so perhaps someone out there, they're kind of looking to start doing this in a more serious way. Are there any tools, any kind of technologies that you use to help you track those risks, to help you kind of, not quantify them, but record them?
That one is a little bit of a difficult one because, there are many tools out there that you can use. As Alexforbes, there is a particular tool that we are using, but what we find is very important is to have a very robust and solid methodology. So your own internal methodology that you use, and then you obviously use it within the system. The current system that we use is helpful from a combined assurance perspective. So what that really means is there is work that first line is doing, like I'm sitting in first line. There's work that second line, which is the enterprise risk management function, is doing. Then there's work that is done by internal audit, external audit. So once everything is done within the system, it's easy for all of the parties to sort of have a view of what work is being done and are we adequately covering, our risk mitigation activities and all of that. So it's always nice to have a tool which makes it simple to, to bring things to the fore, to make them visible to everyone who needs to see them. But really the basis of that is a strong foundation, which is your ERM framework.
Okay, cool. And then we've sort of touched on it. I think you kind of said that it's about kind of simplification of stuff. But how do you explain cyber and IT risk to the board? I mean, from my relatively limited experience of boards, but kind of covering some of the stuff, I think there's perhaps a lack of tech savviness, perhaps, I don't want to say maturity, but maybe there's that lack of understanding the deep technical kind of issues. So how do you explain it to them in a way that they grasp? I mean, you mentioned talking about the bottom line, but is there anything else? Can you give us any examples, perhaps?
Yeah. So it's really just about, simplifying the message. And there is, when you speak to executives and when you speak to the board, they do tend to get, excited about things like, user awareness and training, or somebody got, clicked on a link and they got caught. And it's very exciting to talk about those things. But I think, sometimes once you've talked about those things, but move to the more serious stuff and say, we've got a business strategy, we've got targets as a business. The impact that, having a cyber breach will have on those targets, when you explain it in those terms, then it starts making sense to them, because the executives are all about, we've got these targets, we've got to reach these targets, and if there's anything that would hinder us from reaching those targets, then we've got to be aware of them, and be involved in making sure that that doesn't happen. And so when you link the two, then it starts to make sense for them.
Okay. And then perhaps in closing, how do you keep your cyber risk management program up to date? I mean, obviously, like at the high level, you have to kind of say, stop clicking on stuff. But on the sort of the real world, we know that there's evolution of threats happening all the time. So kind of constantly evolving environment. So how do you keep your side of, I guess, relaying it to the business and the risk side of it up to date? And how often do you need to do that? How often do you need to update it?
So usually we have a plan for a year.
Okay.
We plan for a year ahead, and we say these are all the things that we're going to do in terms of risk assessments, internal controls, vulnerability management, remediation. But what I find is that because things are ever changing, we need to be flexible to change that plan. And should anything happen that may impact us, we need to be able to build it into our flexible plan.
Sure.
I mean, there's things happening around artificial intelligence. How do we use it to our benefit, or how do we become more aware of how it may impact us negatively, and how do we then build it into our plan? So it's really about having a forward-looking plan, but which is also flexible to deal with the many changes that happen on a daily basis.
Okay. And where does AI, like this kind of current generative AI, where does that fit on your kind of risk scales?
So I've just listened to a very interesting talk. The keynote speaker actually spoke about how we can effectively use AI to help us address some of our cybersecurity risks. So instead of sitting there with a problem that you cannot solve, AI has a backdrop of a lot of data that they can use to then, answer some of the questions you may have. So it is actually a positive, and I think, going forward, it is something that we can use. Obviously, machine is a machine, and you need to obviously work together with the machine. So machine and man working together. But it can really be positive in trying to solve some issues that we've been trying to solve for years and years as cybersecurity experts.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, Khumo, that's been fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time.
I really enjoyed this. Thank you very much.